Will the real presuppositionalist please stand up? I recently listened to a several-hour-long hangout with several theists and a couple of guest atheists. There appeared to be a recurring theme. One of the theistic panelists kept pointing out where the guest atheists were begging the question. From his repeated criticisms, I gleaned that this must be, in fact, a bad thing. Now, joking aside, this got me thinking, and after having been inspired by a Karen S. video, I remembered a challenge I had issued several videos back. I went back to my upload to see if any theists had answered my challenge to either show how their argument didn't end up in a circularity, or to have some integrity and admit that they do. What do you know? As Charles Kunkel had correctly predicted, my challenge went unanswered. Not a single rabid presuppositionalist had answered my challenge. I've heard the phrase, put up or shut up, a lot in the past couple of weeks. It seems that I did put up, and they did shut up. The idea of begging the question, which is a formal logical fallacy when making an argument because it is the act of smuggling in the conclusion into your premise, reminded me of the oft-repeated mantra of the rabid presuppositionalist. The proof that God exists is that without him you can't know anything. Oh, okay. So what you're saying is that you know God exists because if he didn't, you couldn't know anything. Geez, aren't you begging the question there? Hint, yes you are. The funny thing is, these rabid presuppositional apologists, or cyclones if you will, often say that they presuppose God as a necessary first cause for truth, rationality, morality, etc. But the way in which they conduct their apologetic is to give the appearance that they aren't relying on presuppositions, as if they have single-handedly solved the problem of infinite justificatory regress or the fallacy of a circular argument. Sometimes, if pushed hard enough, they will admit their circularity, but will dress it up as virtuous, which in and of itself is disingenuous, and I would suggest that a named fallacy needs to be invented, if one doesn't already exist, to classify this practice. Perhaps the cosmetic fallacy, a bad argument all gussied up for church on Sunday. Here's the rub. The rabid apologist is asking an incoherent question as a trap. They are leading you by the hand into the trap of trying to present reason as a justification for reason, knowing full well that this is fallacious because it comprises a circular argument. I wonder, what's worse, the average person who doesn't often think about rationality or epistemology attempting to justify reason using reason, or an apologist leading them there intentionally, knowing full well that the very question is incoherent as an entrapment? To answer correctly, I'd say my justification for reason is that I presuppose its validity. Reason, rationality, and cognition are my presuppositions. Yes, I am a presuppositionalist. In fact, in this scenario, I might arguably be the only one. You see, the rabid apologist will attempt to reduce your worldview, a term I reject, by the way, as it relates to atheism, to, as they call it, absurdity. Now again, I presuppose reason, rationality, and cognition as valid, and in fact would argue that the only truly absurd worldview would be one in which you did not presuppose those things. For such a position would be completely debilitating. What could you do? Not trusting your reason or cognition would be truly stagnating. It would also be self-refuting. For while it's merely circular to attempt to use reason to validate reason, it is completely incoherent to attempt to use reason to invalidate reason. It is absurd, much in the same way that rejecting the law of non-contradiction would be, for if you didn't believe in non-contradiction, you just might. Now getting back to presuppositions, it's interesting to note that while the apologist says he's a presuppositionalist, his tactics betray him. Every action he takes gives the impression that he's trying to expose an infinite regress or circular argument by his opponent, obviating the need to be void of those same problems within his own argument. Every motion is designed to hide the fact that his own argument does rest on a fallaciously circular premise, For in order to say that they've reduced you to absurdity, they must have solved the problems of infinite regress and/or circular arguments, or we are simply talking about two different but epistemologically equal arguments, and there is no gotcha moment. And so the deception proceeds. From that first question-begging statement that the proof that God exists is that without him you couldn't know anything, to the triumphalism so well documented by Karen S. in her recent upload that prompted her to rename the presuppositional apologetic the condescensional apologetic. In other words, their very attempts to trump or pwn atheism forces them into a corner where they must argue in a circle and consequently must create a diversion to keep this from plain view. The bottom line, as I'm sure Ozzy might say, is that you can't have your circular argument and eat it too. I say, if you're a Christian, rest proudly on your presuppositions as your justification for knowledge claims. Do not, however, trot them out as though they have somehow solved the problems of regress or circularity, lest you be guilty of violating your own theology. And while you're at it, please don't attempt to lure the uninitiated non-believer into a baited trap with an incoherent question for that very same reason. In fact, I'll make you a deal. I won't try to use reason to validate reason, and you stop with the question begging and smoke screens. There's no absurdity here for anyone attempting to use reason, so long as they admit that they presuppose its validity. In the end, I'm left with two possibilities. Either the rabid apologist is being intentionally deceptive, or they are unwittingly perpetuating a deception. Quite obviously, the former is more troubling on its face, whereas the latter amounts to primarily self-deception or cognitive bias on the part of the apologist. I'm reminded of a car dealership where I was once employed. In many such dealerships, the service department and the body shop bear the overhead costs for the entire business. Generally, this is done to best manage their tax burden, and from what I understand, it is common practice. At some point, the decision was made to close the body shop because, as was told to the employees, it was losing money. Naturally, the body shop manager was upset, for as he put it, the body shop was quite profitable, and it was the disproportionate burden of the operating costs of the entire business laid to rest on the body shop's ledger that gave the appearance of non-profitability. They had fooled themselves. I would say, it's one thing to have creative bookkeeping to minimize your tax burden. It's another thing entirely to be fooled by your own creative bookkeeping. Incidentally, that dealership is no longer in business. Thanks for watching.